Hi everyone, I'm back with my top 10 highlights for Mounce Chapters 14 and 15. Let's begin with Chapter 14, which is all about phrasing. Phrasing, as Mount calls it, is really just a way of trying to analyze the structure of a text in the Greek New Testament or in the English New Testament, and trying to analyze the structure by displaying it in a way that highlights how parts of a sentence are structured together to create meaning. We've seen how words create meaning, and we've begun to see how grammar creates meaning. And perhaps you've sensed that meaning also lies at this next larger level that we're calling structural. There is structural meaning, and we need to learn how to analyze the parts of a sentence and how they fit together to create a structure and a meaning, and how sentences fit together into a paragraph or a pericope or a section, how they work together to create meaning. So that's what we're trying to do when we talk about phrasing in Chapter 14. We're talking about what you might call structural analysis of a text in the New Testament in either English or Greek. So my tip number one, and both of my tips, there are only going to be two for this chapter, both are going to be about general things, because interacting with phrasing in the chapter as Mounce presents it to you is more detailed than I want to get into in my top 10. You can always, though, get in touch with me to ask about something that you read in Mounce, and you can do that by email or text or by asking to get in touch with me by FaceTime or Zoom. So my first tip from Chapter 14 is this. As Mounce says, there is more than one way to do structural analysis. Phrasing is one way. It's the way he recommends. It's the way you're going to learn as we go through his textbook. He mentions diagramming. That's another way to analyze the structure of a text. He shows you a little bit about diagramming in this chapter. Klink showed you still another form of structural analysis in his commentary. That's why I had you read the sections marked translation and structure and literary form last week, so you would get to see how he lays out a text visually, highlighting the way its pieces fit together and doing structural analysis in the way that he does it. I use my own method. You may develop a method of your own. I'd be glad to share the method that I use with you, and if you ask me, I will, but I don't want to do it until you've learned how to use Mounce's phrasing method. This is a good basic method of structural analysis to start off with. And afterwards, if you want to see the way that I do structural analysis, I'll be glad to share it with you. My tip number 2 on Chapter 14 is this. Phrasing is something Mounce describes very well in terms of process and the kind of results it can produce for you in terms of meaning. So as I've said, I'm not going to go over that. But I will say that you will find it particularly helpful in the New Testament genre that we call letters or epistles. Phrasing, structural analysis, is particularly helpful in understanding the meaning in a letter or an epistle. And so you ought to take your time and learn about phrasing well from the textbook. Underline, try to grasp the ideas, and work your way through the exercises that Mounce asks you to do as you work your way through the chapter. Take a good look at Mounce's video if you need reinforcement. And if you have questions about the method from either the textbook or video, again, get in touch with me and ask. I'll be happy to try to help you understand so you can use phrasing well. Let's move on then to Chapter 15 in Mounce and verbal aspect. I want to say some things about verbal aspect to you and highlight points you'll find Mounce saying in this chapter. First of all, by way of introduction, you've already begun to discover how important aspect is for verbs in the Greek New Testament, and how much meaning can be derived when you think about aspect as you're reading the Greek New Testament, even though you're an English speaker. Why is aspect so important? Because Greek readers and writers think about aspect of a verb when they hear or write. They want to convey Greek New Testament speakers, Koine New Testament Greek speakers, want to convey to their listener or their reader the kind of action first, the aspect of the action first. That's primary. That's what Mounce reminds you of in 15.1. Then, in 15.2 through 4, Mounce reviews and expands on what he's told you in Chapter 8 about verbal aspects in Greek. In terms of undefined, notice what Mounce says in his first 3 sentences. Underline those sentences in 15.2. They're important to understand and keep in mind. Then in terms of continuing, underline the words not concerned about the beginning or the end. In terms of perfective, underline the first sentence. But know that many New Testament scholars, including me, would add that perfective does indeed primarily refer to effect in the present, but it still says nothing about the future or how long the effects of the perfect aspect may last beyond the present into the future. In other words, that's just what they may do. The effects may last into the future too. How will you know? Context will determine your interpretation. My next tip concerns Mounce chapter 15, verses 5, 6, and 7. Pay attention in these sections to how aspect is being defined with respect to the primacy of the speaker's perspective and the way aspect continues to work in relation to the aorist and imperfect tenses, so that they can be interchangeable sometimes. How will you know? That's part of the art of exegesis. As New Testament scholars say sometimes, this is a matter of interpretation. That means there's often more than one possibility at play, and interpretation becomes a matter of deciding which possibility the grammar can allow, which possibility fits the context in the New Testament text that you're looking at, the context best. My next tip concerns Mounce chapter 15, verses 8 through 11. In these sections, Mounce talks about the interplay between aspect, which is primary, and tense or time, which is secondary. How do they relate to each other? In 15:8 through 11, Mounce shows you how time related to aspect can be used to provide and describe an action that is narrow band, action that happens within a narrow band of time. That time he shows you can be short, he calls short time instantaneous. It can be a little longer, he calls that progressive. And there's overlap here between 15.10 and 15.12, as we'll see when we get to 15.12. Or narrowband time can be about a period of time related to the start or the beginning of an action, and that's called ingressive. Narrowband of time, instantaneous, progressive, or ingressive. My next tip concerns Mounce 15.12 through 16. In these sections, Mounce shows you how actions that are broadband occur over a long period of time and can describe actions that are repeated or continuous. This is iterative. We call that an iterative tense, or an iterative use of the tense and aspect. This is the one that can be blended into, or that overlaps in part with 15.10, the progressive way of looking at tense and aspect. The second broadband actions that occur over a long period of time have to do with regular or habitual action. These are called customary. And the final category of broadband or long period of time as it relates to aspect is called nomic or gnomic. This is something that is always true, a truth that is across all times. It's true across all times. And so you can talk about tenses being describing instantaneous time, progressive time, or ingressive time. Those are all narrow band of time tense aspect combinations. Or you can talk about tense aspect combinations concerning repeated action, that's iterative action, regular or habitual action, that's customary action, or something that's always true, that's gnomic action. Finally, my last tip for you is in Mounce chapter 15 and section 19, where Mounce talks about Aktiensart. He does this in case you meet that term, that word, in someone's analysis or someone's commentary about a verb in the Greek New Testament. But notice two things that Mounce says. First, he says the concept of Aktiensart is too advanced for you right now. That means don't pay too much attention to this section, read through it, and become initially acquainted with it. That's all you can do at this point. Just know what the word kind of generally means. The second thing Mounce says is about how the full meaning of a verb has to be found in the relationship between all of the relevant grammatical pieces of its meaning: aspect, tense, mood, voice, person, number. And there are other factors to consider as well, and those are primarily structural factors. But if you remember that Aktiensart is about everything that relates to a verb, that's all you really need to know about that word Aktiensart. There's no need to remember it. If you ever forget what the word Aktiensart means, you can look it up in the index in Mounce, or you can look at the definition in your pocket dictionary. And you may want to take a look at that. It's very brief, but it says in a very concise way a little bit more than what Mounce says. Anyway, I hope these tips are helpful to you. These are two important chapters, and thanks for continuing to make your way through this introductory course on Greek.